Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Holly Samuelson. I'm an assistant professor at the GSD, and I teach energy and environmental systems classes, primarily in architecture. So it is with great pleasure today that I'm able to introduce you to Ken Yeang. Ken told me that I should not tell you that he does not pick his nose and that his mother loves him, and end there. But I already prepared this, so I'm going to read it anyway. Dr. Ken Yeang is an architect, a planner, an ecologist, and an author. He is best known for his signature ecologically focused architecture and planning projects. He has even been called the father of the bioclimatic skyscraper. He is the principal of Hamza and Yeang, with offices in Malaysia, the UK, and China. Over 4 decades, he has completed over 200 projects and several books. He's also received numerous awards, including the Aga Khan Award, Prince Claus Award, Malaysian Institute of Architects Gold Medal, and Malaysia's Merdeka Award. Dr. Yeang was even featured on the PBS series E-Square Design, where he was introduced by Brad Pitt. I guess I wasn't available that day. I think I first learned of Ken's work back in 2003 when the National Building Museum had an exhibit called Big and Green with a book of the same name, and you can see that this has been well loved by me. I remember seeing the exhibit and Ken's work in particular and being very inspired. Until then, I really didn't associate his ecological design strategies like access to nature, use of vegetation, natural ventilation with large-scale projects. If these strategies were used at all, it was primarily on small projects at that time. And the challenges to this jump in scale to a skyscraper is multifold. Space is at a premium in an urban environment. Air pressure differences over the span of a skyscraper make natural ventilation tricky. And I think there's also a cultural difference. These weren't small niche projects for environmental nonprofits. These were IT consultants and business executives. So the fact that Ken dreamed it, got the client to see it, and got it built is very inspiring. So his work inspires me, and it still does, and I'm sure that a host of other designers feel the same way. So it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce you to Dr. Yeang.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, to be invited by Mawson, taught me everything I know. I'm going to talk about the work I've been doing for a few years. And I have a lot of slides to cover, so I'm going through it fairly quickly. And if you want me to go back to it again, I can do that later on. But the thesis for today is how we can design the built environment as constructed ecosystems. Now, I had to study ecology at Cambridge University. They don't call it ecology in Cambridge University, it's rather pompous university. They call it environmental biology. Now, ecology sees the Earth as covered by this thin film called the biosphere, which is where organisms live. Oh, could you switch up the lights, please? Then, now, around the biosphere, which is about 10,000 meters high, you have the biochemical cycles. And ecosystems consist of communities of plants and animals and the physical environment acting together to form a whole. Now, the holistic property is very important because that's what differentiates ecosystems from other combinations of organic and inorganic. Now, the communities of plants and animals and the physical environment interact in very complex ways. Then, within the community of plants and animals, we have one particular species, which is human beings. And we are the most powerful of species. We can change nature, we can change landscapes, we can extract huge amount of energy from fossil fuels, and now we're able to change the global climate. And so now human beings make artifacts. We make what I call the built environment. Human beings make more artifacts than any other species in nature. And it is the built environment and its production systems that contaminate and affect the climate change. So that's the story of the existing situation at the moment. 20 years ago, it was just design was preventive action, but now it's a race and rescue mission. So it's actually, for me, it's a serious matter. Now, when I first started working in this field, it occurred to me that everything that we make as human beings is physical. Take this building that we're in. Everything in this building is physical except you and me and the bugs. So where is the organic constituent? So the thesis that I'm presenting today is what happens if we bring the two together? Combine the organic environment, biotic environment, with the abiotic to make what we call constructed ecosystems. So one of the first things we did, 20, 30 years ago, was to see how we can balance and integrate the abiotic and the abiotic. So I started to do what I call icons or patterns of how they could be related. You can either be in one spot, as you can see in the first diagram. You could have a spotty relationship with the second one. You have a stepping stone, the third one, and the ideal one's the third one, which is the continuous one. And this is what it means in planning terms, that you can have one location as in Central Park, New York. You can have a series of green squares as in George and London. You can have a series of ecological corridors and fingers. So the early experiments, I went through a series of these in my early work. And this was a building we did maybe 20, 30 years ago. And it's and this was taken actually in 2017, so it's survived reasonably well over 20, 30 years. I wish I could do that with myself, but not anymore. And this is the ground floor. Now this is the floor plate of the building. I put the vegetation on the terraces around the periphery of the building. And then there's a column-free floor plate. It's about 25 meters from the top to the bottom. It's ideal for financial institutions. At the same time, I was looking into passive moat design. And this is some studies that we did on how the core position, the elevator core position, can influence the energy performance of the skyscraper. And so the most effective one is the one as identified here. These were studies we did for Tokyo, which is about, I can't remember what's latitude. And that if you look at the floor plate, all the cores have natural ventilation opportunities. And that means it doesn't have to be, the core doesn't have to be fire protected, pressurized, and the staircases and the toilets have natural ventilation. And so these sort of cores on the east and west side, as you can see in the diagram left side, they work as thermal buffers between the outside and the inside. That's the building. But it was not satisfactory because the vegetation is not continuous. It is disparate, but certain species like vertebrates can move from one to the other, but the terrestrial type species cannot. And so next was trying to make it continuous. I call it the ecological nexus, which is making the habitats connected. And so the next experiment was what I call a stepping stone. It's like a series of stepping stones, not connected, but it is almost connected, but pretty close. And with this project, the two planters were connected by a trellis so that the vegetation can climb up from one end to the other end. And the idea was to step up, up to the building, let's face the building. But of course, halfway up the building, you run out of the building. So we brought it across the floor, and that's where we put the mechanical systems. We call it plant rooms of the client, and brought it up on the other side. Again, you can see the cores on the east and west side, and it's the same idea again. Now, then I started to develop the idea, what happens if the nexus is linked as a series of landscape ramps? I call this a linear habitat. So the idea was that by being linked, it enables species movement, enables species interaction, and enables, because it's linked, enables a larger pool of shared resources and engenders a larger level of biodiversity, and generally it's a much more stable system. So this was the drawing that we did. We thought, well, rather than just having a linked ramp of vegetation that climbs up the building, we put a walkway so that people could service the planting and the organic life without going through the interior of the building, and so it doesn't bother the users of the building. And so this was done, and it took me about maybe 5 to 8 years before I actually were able to realize it. And here it is, here's the walkway, that's the planting, and that's the facade, sun shading on top. And this is the building that we did with the vegetation that goes all the way up the building. And this is the view of the building from the southeast. The idea was to bring the vegetation up one floor. So with every floor, with every facade, I move up one floor, and it goes all the way up to the top, and this is the walkway. And that, now, rather than just a boring sort of linear, I call it a linear park, it's 1.3 kilometers long if you pull it out. And at the corners, I have little plazas where people could interact between the inner park and the people inside. And that's where one of the plazas. That's another view of one of the plazas. And then the mid-level have a mid-level roof garden, and then it goes up again, and then it joins to the uppermost roof garden, which gives a terrific view of this part of Singapore. So these were different systems we had for greening. I put the roofs and the walls and the ground, and we want to bring it all the way down to the basement. I call it the eco cell. And so this is, for this particular building, it winds, spirals. When it reaches the ground level, spirals all the way down to the basement. And this is where it's located, and I call this an eco cell. Because at the bottom, you can have actually a John Todd type living machine or a rainwater harvesting tank that you have here. But it brings vegetation down to the lowest level, provides opportunities for rainwater harvesting, natural ventilation to the inner parts of the building, and brings daylight, and you can have a living machine at the bottom. Now the building actually is 2 blocks, A and B, joined by a bridge, and this is what a bridge is that joins the 2 buildings. And one of the experiments we had was to have what we call a diagonal light shaft. We wanted to have a holographic glass at the bottom that throws the light up the shaft, but the client, didn't want to spend the money. And my friend Dr. Miller from Gelsenkirchen starts producing the holographic glass. This is looking up from the street level. You can see the atrium at the top, and that this is the light shaft, and you can see the shaft cut as a whole void in the floor plate in the right-hand diagram. This is the daylight simulation. It's fairly dark in the middle because we want to optimize the daylight. But the building form was part of the master plan, which was done by Zaha, and she was the master planner, and she won a competition, beating Ito and a few other people. So this is looking up, and you can see the atrium at the top. At the top of this big hole, this big void, and that's looking down at the street level. You can see the atrium, and the little red square shows the hole that comes out, at the top of the atrium. So this was the building that we did back in 2009, I think. And these are different ways we put vegetation buildings. And the 4th diagram shows the building we did at University of Hong Kong, but this time brought the vegetation in the ziggurat pattern going up to the top. Another example is this data center we did for a Swedish Scandinavian telco company. And a data center is basically a box of machine, and so had limited budget, and we put a vegetation that zigzags across the facade. It goes around one facade, the other facade, and back down again to where it's first started. And the top of the building, we tilted the roof a little bit where we could photovoltaics to provide energy to power the irrigation system. And the system's actually, unlike the ones that Patrick Blanc does, there's a series of cassettes, so that in case the vegetation fails, we can just take out the cassette and replace it, rather than Patrick's system, he has to rip out all the vegetation. And we try and put the fresh air intake for air conditioning behind the green wall, so the green wall can scrub the air before it enters. And this is the atrium, the entry atrium, which is naturally ventilated. And the building uses about 150 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum, compared to a typical office building, which uses 210. So by all means and purposes, it's an energy building. But that's not enough. We should head towards net zero. Sorry, this is just the water consumption, which you can't see the slide. And here's the building as it's completed. Now, the next was these. At this point in time, you probably think, well, all Ken does is just put veggies in his buildings. Okay, I can do that too, and a lot of my competitors do that too. People at Warha, people like that. But I do much more than this. I create habitats to enhance the biodiversity. So this building we just completed about less than 6 months ago, and it's about 1.3 million square feet. We won this in the competition, and there's the view looking down from the central plaza. And it has an experimental, it's a double skin building, so the outer skin is actually fritted glass, which acts as an experimental sunshade, and this is the view from the promenade. And now this is what we do. We establish habitats at different parts of the site, on the ground, in the building, in the walls, in the balconies, in the roof. And so, and the building actually happens to be aligned with the plaza, which is called the Wawasan Putrajaya. Opposite is the Ministry of Finance, and actually it was a bit of a fight because the authorities want us to emulate the facade of the Ministry of Finance, which is designed by one of my friends, which more than I know, which is GDP. But we fought it, resisted it until, well, finally, there's basically two V-shaped buildings which are almost symmetrical, but not quite. It's not symmetrical because I had to align with nexus going all the way down. Now, these are different habitats in the building. And so having established habitats, the next we do is to do research on the native species of fauna that we want to bring back, whether it's for feeding, breeding, or refuge, or for prey. And that from the habitats and the research, the next thing we did was to identify the flora that will attract the fauna. And then from there, we matched the two to establish biodiversity targets, and this becomes the basis for us to design the landscape conditions for the building. So the building becomes a total living system. So to construct the ecosystem is actually taking an inert, inorganic chunk of concrete and steel and glass and make it into a living system. And that's what I think architects should be doing, is to design buildings as living systems. And this is what I've been trying to do for most of my life. Now, between two V-shaped buildings, you have an axis, and the axis joins to a monument near the waterfront, which was also designed by us about 6-8 years earlier, that we again won in a competition. And that's the monument with the surrounding buildings, the Ministry of Finance in between. And you can see the axis from the site across the promenade down the monument. And then the other dotted line shows the boulevard that goes straight up to the Prime Minister's office. So it's an important location for me and an important, highly visible project. This view of the promenade with all sorts of seating spaces, which we try and make it a little bit more organic and less regimented. The aesthetic was the idea of a diamond, because this is an upmarket location, so it has a facade. And we use the second skin, which is glass with a fritted pattern as a sunshade. And we had to have, according to our engineers, 50% solid to 50% opaque for the facade. And we had to have it, give it a cultural identity, because this is in Putrajaya. And so we use a Songket pattern, which is the pattern which is a Malay pattern for one of the fabric, which we use for formal events. The building uses 136 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum, compared to 210 for other buildings in the locality. Now, the west side is different. We angle it so that it keeps out the west sun, and so this is a detailed west side. And that, again, we have an eco-cell where the staircase brings the vegetation from the third floor all the way down to the basement. And so this is the scheme that we did. This was the idea of designing the building, enhancing the biodiversity, and making the building into a living system. Now, that's a medium-rise building. So what do you do with a high-rise building? And so we did what we call a vertical stratification of habitats. And this building we're working on, and James here is working with us. James is a zoologist and is doing lighting and species with us on this project. And we first of all look at the ecology of the location, and this is the large-scale ecological context, and then we look at the one at the meso level, and so you can see these are green areas, and these are different habitats we create in the building on the ground level, in this in the vertical rises, in a series of terraces, and the roof garden, and this is the biodiversity targets we established for this project. But what we did in the high rise is to stratify it. So the lower levels is for dragonflies, mid levels for butterflies, and sort of the second part, the third is for songbirds and migratory birds on the uppermost segment of the building. So this was that's the idea of putting habitats in the vertical structure. And this building we're working on in Indonesia, and these are the stratification for this building, and vegetation is brought up in a series of spirally plants going up to the top. Now, this bit is probably the most important bit that if I were to leave this room, that you must stick in your mind, because nature does not just nature produces ecosystem services, which we cannot see because it's invisible, or almost invisible. So with the ecosystems, what nature does is produce oxygen, produce genetic diversity, all these things. Nature does it for us without human intervention. And it does it for free. We don't have to pay for it. Now, if you take, for example, one of these, like sequestering or detoxification of human industrial waste. Now, this is probably one of the most important aspects that nature does because it sequesters and assimilates the contaminants gases that our production systems produce. Now, if we continue to produce systems, and which is still ongoing, and the consequence of this doesn't doesn't get removed overnight, and some of what we've done in the past continues into the future. Now, if you look at these systems nature does for us, it is impossible for human technology to imitate, to emulate it. Just the production of oxygen. We can't produce enough oxygen for the whole of the biosphere. And so if we continue to destroy nature, to devastate nature, the ability of nature to produce ecosystem services is not infinite, it's limited, and the time will come probably within the next 50 to 100 years when all the ecosystems will collapse. And so the idea of saving the planet is actually a very important issue. So now, if we're not able to produce this technologically, what are the ways we could do this? One of the ways is to increase the green areas in the city, to enable a larger area of organic mass to produce ecosystem services, or we can link the existing green areas in the city, or we could and put ecological fingers, or the fourth way is to weave ecological corridors and ecological fingers into the built environment, or put this into our new environment. And so this is a system, an idea we worked on, where we weave the greening and the urban conurbations as two clasp hands, and to bring it together. And this is the master plan we did for a little island southeast of Madagascar called the Reunion Island. And here we brought the vegetation from one side going up in green, and then in the urban areas from the road, and the vegetation goes underneath the highway into the hills. There's a series of vegetative striations because that's the natural irrigation patterns on the particular site. And so there's the view of this development from the hills, and that's the vegetation system. It goes all the way up to the hills, and this is the built-up areas going all the way down to the south. And by weaving the two together, and it's about, we had a discussion, we had done some experiments, and it's about 30 meters wide for the urban areas and about 20 meters of vegetation. And so this is about the pattern that we adopted for this project. Now we had roads cutting across the other side. Now the roads would then bifurcate, the green areas. So what do we do? So the solution we had was to have what we call ecological undercrofts. So you have two sides which is cut by a highway or a road in between. What happens if you cut underneath the road and let the vegetation go through? We call this an eco undercroft. So in this way, the ecological system is connected, and the species is able to move across the landscape, to cross its fingers. And the edges also must not be pristine because, this discourages species from, going to the edges of the green areas, and it should be serrated, so it gives places for species to hide and to procreate. So this is a system that we developed. This is only the last of the four systems, which is the weaving of the organic with the inorganic in this pattern, and these are the series of ways we start to look at. I haven't got time to show you our experience with the other three concepts, but this is just an example. Now, you have experts here on energy efficiency, and that this is one of the things that we have to do as part of conservation of energy resources, and to try and move from the use of energy of non-renewable energy resources to a renewable situation. Now, the relationship between our buildings and environments, where we take in huge inputs of energy, materials, food, and people, and gives the outputs of waste energy, waste measures, and so forth. And this, if you like, is the model of the relationship of the built diagram, of the built system with natural environment. And if you look at energy, then it takes in inputs of energy from natural resources at the moment, it goes into the build system, gives that waste heat, and some of it can be recycled, but it, obviously in a lower form, and then it goes discharged into the environment. Now, what you have in Boston is a jolly cold winter. Well, it's not jolly, actually, a really cold winter, and a very hot summer. And so now what engineers do is to give us consistent temperature, humidity, air change throughout the whole year, which is that red line. And so if we use renewables, and sometimes it's almost impossible for renewables to almost equate with the red line, we can get as close as we can. And so this is a design that we did for the idea of a building as a power station, where the building itself generates its own energy, and that the building, is angled so that it gets the energy from the sun. And according to our studies, you need at least 42% of the floor area to be with photovoltaics to make it work independently. Now that's extremely difficult for tall buildings, but probably easier for medium-rise buildings. And so from there we move on to what we call passive low-energy design, which is another word for it. It's called bioclimatic design, where you design with the climate of place, and you shape the building, you orientate it in an appropriate way, you design the facade, and you try to make use of the optimized climatic conditions, location, and you make use of natural ventilation. One of the ideas we had is what we call the umbrella building. And the umbrella is an incredibly useful device because it keeps out the rain, keeps out the sun, and lets the wind through, and so and then you can actually adjust it depending on the direction of the wind and the way it's and the wind. And so this was an experiment we did back in maybe 30 years ago, where we put the umbrella, was a sort of louvered umbrella, in which we let in the morning sun, keeps out the afternoon sun, let the rain collect in the roof to harvest the rainwater, and we let the wind through in the middle of the roof. And this was completed in 1985, 86. There's a view showing the louvers on top of the building, which is angled to keep out the midday sun. It's not exactly north-south. You can see north is there, but it's as close as we could because of the site conditions. We used the water as the evaporative cooling device in a swimming pool, and that's the pool, in the south on the west of the site. And there's a staircase going up to a roof, and there's a little spiral staircase, the void in between. And then there's a passageway from the outside to the inside. Is Rahul here? Where's Rahul? Oh, there you are. Because your father-in-law, she visited the building and says, I got to see what it's like starting from the outside of the building. So he came in, walked out again, and went through the house, and this is where he went through the house. And we designed the building so to blur the inside and the outside. So the building becomes a series of courtyards. We split the walls. So the building's no longer like an isolated object within a fence area, but it blurs the relationship between the inside and the outside, and uses about 42 kilowatt-hours per square meter per annum. And it's right by the woods, and here it is. There's the view from just outside the house, and there's a monkey outside. So that's the house that's completed. So we carry on with the umbrella idea. This is a transportation hub with much of contemporary aesthetic. The house was designed back in 1985 when the only aesthetic I could develop at the time was using the Corbusian aesthetic. And this accomplishment we just won, which is the master plan for University of Malaya, where over the university hub, that's where it is. We put a glass canopy, and this area view of the master plan. This is another project we're working on now, where we put the umbrella as a folded series of plates. That's the top view of the umbrella, and there's a side view umbrella. And then one of the projects we just completed in just outside Beijing is this train station, where there's a folded plate, and this is what it looks like. And this is the master plan for the station, and that's the roof plan for the station, which is about 6 lines going across. Now, from bioclimatic design, we move on to what I call mixed mode, which is low energy design. And this is again in the hot humid tropics, and I'll show one in the cold climate later on. And in this building, So you move from the comfort conditions move from the blue dotted line to the white, which is bioclimatic, improved comfort conditions without use of mechanical systems. Then the dotted line shows improved comfort conditions with some mechanical electrical systems. So back to this old project that I showed earlier on, we have an atrium in the middle and the ground floor. These are not air-conditioned spaces, and that there's some cold air being blown. You can see the white lines. And then on the top of this, I have an atrium. I have a glass louvered roof, and this is looking up in the glass roof, which is powered by sensors. And so that you can see the atrium in the bottom left diagram. You can see the two blocks A and B, which linked by this bridge are indicated. And then on a normal day, it all opens out to let the hot air out. And that if it rains, it has sensors, automatically closes it. And there's a sort of jazz singer called Jelly Roll Morton. One of his songs says, "Let hot air out." And this is the view of the glass roof. So it's operable, it's automated. I need to extend this all the way up to the whole facade of the whole roof and facade of the building, so the whole building becomes, if you like, a filter, like an environmental filter. Now, how about in a cold climate? Cold climate like what you have, and this is the project we did in London, and London is about 52 degrees above the equator, 51 to 30 minutes, and Boston is about 42, which is just below London in terms of climatic zone. And what we try to do is to see whether we can make use of mixed mode. Now, this is the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. This was done back in 2010. And what we did was to put a flue glass wall in front. And the flue glass wall sucks up the air from the lower floors using a valve, and then that's the valve at the top. We vary the valve so that the temperature of these three spaces is only effective during the mid-season, which is spring and autumn. So the idea was to extend the mid-season, which is the best time of the year, into a little bit into winter, a little bit in the summer, and so it reduces the need for air conditioning in winter, heating in winter, and air conditioning in the summer, so it reduces the energy consumption of the building. And so this is the extension of the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. And so in summary, these are different energy strategies where we move from the outside climate. We use passive mode to reduce the energy consumption by use of building configuration, orientation, and so forth. Then we use mixed mode, and then where possible, use productive mode. And for the full mode, we try to use the most efficient systems we can get. Now, the next idea that I started to think about is infrastructures. Now, what a lot of architects do nowadays is to do green buildings. Now, even if you do a single building, it's inconsequential. The effect is, is incremental. And it's totally useless if these buildings are connected to the grid, in which energy source comes from burning fossil fuels. And so we have to rethink how we design. We should design infrastructures. Start with the green infrastructure before we put in the green buildings, because once you put in green infrastructure, then designing green buildings becomes much more easier and facilitates the whole city or the urban conurbation that you design to become green. Now, you talk to any green architect today, they'll say, well, there's the two main infrastructures: the green, which is not a particularly new idea for me, and that's the blue, which is hydrology of the location. But to me, there are two other infrastructures, which is the human infrastructure, because human societies provide services which makes the urban environment work. And then there's the gray, which is technology. Now, the gray, there are two types of infrastructure. That's the one which is underground, which you cannot see, and the one which is our buildings. Our buildings are actually infrastructure because all the mechanical, electrical systems, power, service activities take place inside the building. And so green infrastructure, green design to me, is how we can bring all these together into a whole. And so this is the diagram which tells, which explains that green ecological design is integration of green with the blue, with the red and the gray into a whole. And that's a way of looking at green design. And so that's the scheme that we did in Bangalore in India. And you can see, we brought the vegetation all the way down, pick up all the vegetation from the west side, which is where Forest Reserve, and we stretch it across. And this is the composite of all the infrastructures together brought into a whole. we started with this spine on the forest reserve. We collect all the green vegetation species, stretch across the site as if you stretch a piece of chewing gum, and then so that became the green infrastructure. And then on top of this, we laid the master plan. But what happens was that, as we saw on the other plan, when you put roads across the site, it bifurcates, it cuts the green infrastructure. So the system we started to develop was not the green undercroft, but the idea of eco-bridge, where you have let's have two sites, A and B, which are separated by this highway. What happens if you bridge across and vegetate, and all of a sudden, which were previously two disparate ecosystems, became one single one where you can have a larger pool of resources to be shared. And so this is what eco-bridge looks like. But of course, the locations were important because it relates to where the species are laid on the land. And this is the view from the road. And this is some of all these together. But the water infrastructure is the other infrastructure, which is the hydrology of the land. And you need to bring the water that falls on the land, not on the impervious surfaces, which goes to the drains and is gone forever. We bring it back into the earth to recharge the aquifers and the groundwater. And these are different ways through rain gardens and bioswales and detention ponds. And then for the black water, which is, we have what we call constructed wetland, where we have a series of ponds. This is the natural way of treating black water. So it filters through this series of constructed ponds, so that by the time we reach the last pond, it's almost potable. And so that's the ecological infrastructure that we develop that's a principle of doing the master plan design the city. Now I'm going to end in a minute. I'm going to talk about another idea, which is that if we design the city or the buildings or the urban combinations as construct ecosystems, well, another word for it is what I call eco-sidewalk, which is a hybrid technical natural system, because you need both. You need technology and nature needs technology to make it work. And this is Charlize Theron in Mad Max. And she has a prosthetic arm. And actually, if you watch the film, the arm actually falls off in one part of the film, And now here's a gentleman with prosthetic devices attached to him on different parts of prosthetic arm, prosthetic leg, prosthetic kneecap, prosthetic heart, and prosthetic eyeball. And out of interest, I have a prosthetic heart. Did it about 8 years ago. And everything depends on effective biointegration. Because by analogy, our buildings are like prosthetic devices, artificial, synthetic, is human-made, mostly artificial, and then it has to be connected. The equivalent host organism for our buildings, for our built environment, is the biosphere. In which case, everything depends on effective biointegration, and I call this physical biointegration, which is connecting things physically, or systemic, where it works as a system. Now, here's a poor lady. I'm not sure how effective this is, but it has to be connected. The artificial device is connected to a nervous system, to a muscular system, and there are issues of getting septic because she's probably on antibiotics the whole day. And so this is, if you like, a vision, an image for me of my ideal future, where the built environment is a sidewalk and has exogenous systems connected to it to make it effective as part of nature. And the closest to this is this building we designed, where here we have the ramp going all the way up, integrated system. We have green areas tucked into the building, and this is the idea was that whenever the ramp reaches the same levels as the adjoining building, it bridges out and colonizes it. So it becomes even like a device that makes the city green. And this is one of the floor plates where you can see the vegetation going up in a spiraling fashion. And this was our design for the Kowloon waterfront, a competition scheme that we didn't win. And again, this was how the eco cell idea started to develop. And so the competitions for us are actually like research projects that we hold very preciously, and we're trying to use it again in future projects. And this is a new master plan for a site that we're working on, and these are different components of the site, and this is the structures on the site. So now I'm going to end. These are the models I present to you today: the model of nature, the ecosystems, ecologies, model of nature. These are different models of how we could vegetation and put organic material in biotic material into the abiotic natural environment, idea of the biodiversity matrix to design habitats, looking into how human and their buildings interact with nature. This is the model relationship environment and the Earth environment, and these are some of the things we need to do to enhance and make it more effective. Idea of designing infrastructures as the basis for doing master plans, and brings me to the end.
Now.
I suppose so.
Thank you so much. I'll kick off a question while you're all thinking of yours. Thank you so much. This was, you can just use this one, incredibly inspiring. It did not disappoint. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about your material selections. You talk about weaving in nature in with your buildings, and that seems very obvious. But it's very interesting how your choice of materials is definitely man-made materials. So you have the technological materials interwoven with the all-natural ecosystems, and there's not really a merging of the two. And I was wondering how you decided that.
Well, actually, this is in my latest book, which I'm working on now, which should be out in about 6 months' time. It's called Ecomasterplanning. That means designing, imitating the characteristics of nature. And in this book, I talk about what I call the logistic materials, because materials start from the earth, from the planet, and it goes through a number of stages. It's extracted, it's treated, it is transported, it's fabricated, it is transported again, it is stored, then it is assembled into a building. Eventually, the materials become building gets destroyed, get demolished, and then has to be somehow reused and recycled and returned back to the earth. So I call this the logistics of materials. And what is important is that at each stage in this process of this flow, it impacts the environment. And so not enough work has been done on the logistics of materials. The American civil architects wrote a manual about 15 years ago, maybe a little bit earlier, in which actually it's a very useful manual. It's about 3 inches thick. It's called the ERG, and one section covers the flow of materials. But this is something I'm working on now. But the data isn't there on the consequences of the materials because it's location specific. So if it's in Boston, how do the materials come to this? Be in this building? Where does the cement come from? Where does the gravel come from? Where does the steel come from? Where does the glass come from? Where does the aluminum come from? So it's a very, very onerous process of mapping these materials and the consequences, because at every stage has an impact on locality. In principle, in ecological design, you have to, everything that we do on the planet has an impact. Maybe just putting in buildings, but even planting a tree can have an impact on the environment, because the species could be invasive because of ecology, in which the impact goes not just on the site, but extend beyond the site. And so, yes, it's a good question. I haven't done enough research on it. I hope that somebody else after me will do it, after I start pushing daisies. But it means that the teaching materials at universities, schools of architecture have to change. When people teach materials in schools of architecture, talking about weathering, talking about junctions, talking about aesthetics, talking about how you combine another material. But why don't you teach the flow materials, the logistic materials, and the ecological impacts from times taken from the ground? Because even extraction from the ground has the impact on its location throughout this whole process, this flow into the building, and extends what happened at the end of the life of the building, because the building has a life cycle of its own. And so this is, if you like, it radically changes the teaching materials in schools of architecture.
So building on that, reusing material, what do you see the future of well, the future of construction companies, like the new startup companies. How do these companies need to change their approach to using material and really mapping out the whole process from extracting the raw material and making it into useful things for buildings?
Yes, in some ways you've answered the question, but not only should you look at the impact of material on the ecology, you have to look at the amount of energy that's used at each of these stages, and at the end of the process, you have to be aware of the embodied energy in the building that you design, because the energy is embodied in the materials, in the building, and so I'm not sure how you look at these companies, because that's a business question which is also a realm of expertise. You have to make them green, and that means they have to rethink, the way I see it, the way to do business. And as an architect, as a green architect, and it took me 25 years to build a brand. A lot of green architects think that having done a green building, a lot of owners think that I've got my green building done, fulfills my corporate responsibility. Then he goes back to his, his business, which is polluting the environment. And so what an architect should do, after you design a building, in the process of designing a green building for a particular client, is to change the mindset of your client and tell him that he has to make his business green. And if he starts doing that, then the impact of what you do as an architect is not just to one particular building, but it's exponential. It could extend to all the clients you work with. And that's what we should do with these companies. Tell them to start from scratch and look at the business as a whole, how to make green, how to make it designed in what economists call today a cyclic economy, in which everything is recycled, reused, until it exhausts the useful life of the material, that it can go back into the environment and replenish the environment, or in a seamless way, rather than go to a landfill somewhere, which is what's happening now with all the materials that we use in our built environment. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Thank you so much for, I really appreciate the sort of perspective on architects and designers as designers of habitats. I am really curious though about the kind of social, economic, and political dimension of the construction of these, and how we can think of for example, the skyscraper, we're still designing skyscrapers, and even though it might be a green skyscraper, you kind of alluded to that, the business that's running a skyscraper might not be green, but also, skyscrapers are very much the epitome of a kind of social and economic equality, and the kind of mass consumption. So it's
Okay.
I know you talked a lot about how nature gives us a lot of things for free, but in a way, maybe we should stop thinking about nature as giving us things for free, but sort of giving us a degree of a sort of responsibility, asking for a kind of degree of responsibility from us as designers to kind of
Yes.
give back. And so I'm wondering that sort of dimension to your project.
Socioeconomic, political aspects. Good question. Now, my contention is everything starts with we as human beings, our mindset towards nature, how we should see nature as not as resource to be exploited, not nature that we can use willy-nilly, but so our mindset has to be a green mindset, has to be towards deference to nature, because humanity's mindset determines the socio-economic political institutions it creates, which then determines the physical systems that we build and make, which then has impact on the environment. So everything starts with us as human beings. So we have to change our mindset. Now, how are we going to change that? I don't know. Through education, and there are behavioral experts who could change, but everything has to start with human beings. Now, the idea of skyscrapers is it's not a difficult one, but it relates to the idea. About 20 years ago, I decided that the skyscraper as a building form is not going away, because it's one of the solutions that people have adopted to address rural to urban migration. And so I thought, well, if it's not going to go away, it's going to continue to be built, then we should make it as green as possible, as sustainable as possible. So it's it's a dirty job. Someone has to do it. So we have to make it as green as possible. That's what I try to do. But I don't advocate a skyscraper. It uses a third more energy or materials than as you would in a normal low-rise and medium-rise building. You're right. It's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer it because, every city in the world is building skyscrapers. And, in my skyscraper lecture, there are different ways of handling rural to urban growth. You can either expand the city boundaries, which means you have to build into forested or arable land, or you build a satellite city, like Milton Keynes, which becomes a high-energy solution because the satellite city and the metropolis, or the main city, has to be linked by high-speed, high-energy situation. And so most city fathers go for the third solution, which is to optimize existing land use and find the brownfield sites, the underutilized sites, and to develop on these to accommodate rural urban growth. And so it's a difficult question. It's a difficult issue because skyscrapers not going away. You have to deal with it. You have to cope with it. And that you have to do it, then I would say make it as green as possible.
And would we want the skyscraper to go away if we consider the alternatives and the transportation energy and resources into the equation? Yes.
If you want to build skyscrapers, build them on top of transportation hubs. So then what the plan is called transport orientation development. So this reduces the movement or use of energy by private cars. But the change has to come at the socio-economic, political level, which is beyond the control of the architect. You have to bear in mind that we are just service providers. We're not particularly powerful people. Nobody listens to architects. Sometimes I wish I was a doctor because you tell a lady, take off your clothes. I'm your doctor. She'll take her clothes off. You tell a lady, take off clothes. I'm your doctor. She said, bugger you. So, what I'm trying to say is that we're not politically powerful people. But what you could do is to change the world by example. So let's do exemplary work that then it has a great impact than just, proselytizing what you do to a larger audience.
Thanks so much for your presentation.
Yes, ma'am.
I was curious about the success of your projects in attracting the fauna that you had in mind.
Yes.
Especially because you might have influence over the entire site, but say your site is surrounded by, other like in the context of an urban fabric that doesn't have much support for ecology. I'm wondering how successful the projects are in attracting fauna when they don't have the benefits of, kind of the fringe condition.
Well, that's an argument I'm currently having with my ecologist because he contends a city is an ecosystem. And so finally conceded that a city is a semi-ecosystem. But I have to explain to him a city, has a very small amount of green areas, habitats for species. And that because the habitats are disparate, they're very, not close to each other, the interaction is extremely difficult. So one of the things you need to do, as you see in one of the diagrams that I did, was to try and connect the green areas within a city. So let's say like in London, you have to connect Hyde Park with Regent's Park, all the way down to Green Park, and all the way down to the south, to Surrey if you can. Or in New York, connect Central Park to Washington Square, down to Union Square, and green all the areas right down to the waterfront. But that's a huge undertaking. But it's not impossible because you can use eco-bridges to connect them, because then life can continue. And what happens, the High Line, what happens if it's all green, then could be extended with not just as a corridor with ecological fingers into the green areas. But the effect that the planners have to do that, the politicians have to, have to take the stand and tell the planners to do this. And that how we're going to do that is another issue.
This may be naive, but if you're looking for life cycle cost assessment, I would look at the Natural Step in Sweden and their work on LCAs, and perhaps talk to the architectural firm Snuheta, which is very good on all of these kinds of things.
Yes, sir.
For the last couple of years, I've been collecting URLs about city agriculture and about net zero energy buildings. And what I've noticed over the last year is how they're converging. So for instance, Daniel Libeskind has designed at least 2 buildings which are both net zero energy and include growing spaces. And I think this is will be a continuing trend, particularly as the EU has decided that by 2030, all buildings, including remodeling, will be net zero energy. California has the same kind of standard. Cambridge, Massachusetts here is talking about net zero emissions as a standard. How do you see these as drivers in what you're doing around the world, not just in the EU or California and Cambridge?
Well, net zero energy, you're very careful because a lot of ecological designers think that the end all is LEED or certification or net zero. Well, that to me is a technocratic solution. To me, there are 3 possible ways of design, of sustainable design. One is the technocratic, another you look at the energy, look at the systems, look at materials, look at the life cycle. So the second way is look at it as nature-centric, look at it from nature's point of view, ecology. And so it's not just technocratic as to nature-centric. And the third way is called anthropocentric. That means from human point of view, then a lot of anthropocentric, forgets nature. It says nature is not important to us. Net zero energy is not important to us. We just want to look at social systems. And so you have to look at ecological design from these 3 points of view, not just technocratic, which I think is very good. It does not in any way dismisses what a lot of architects are doing, what you are doing, but it has to be integrated with the nature-centric approach, what I'm proselytizing today, and then with the human-centric approach, where you look at the impact on human environment, on humanity. Now, sure, the world has all sorts of problems. It's got poverty, it's got starvation, poor sanitation, but all these issues, wouldn't it be much easier to address these issues if we have clean environment, clean water, and clean land? And so, in some ways, you have to do both simultaneously. It's not sequential, but you have to look at provide a clean built environment, a clean biosphere, and while at the same time trying to address all these other anthropocentric issues that we have that are important to humanity. Yes, sir.
Hello. Hi.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. From the example you showed, the regions and surrounding environment helps on maintaining the ecosystem like rain, humidity, and temperature. But how would you sustain this level of ecosystem in a region with hot and dry climate like the Middle East? How would you find the balance to meet the healthy ecosystem, but at the same time economically efficient to irrigate the plants with a reasonable cost?
That's a very sensitive question every time I speak in the Middle East, because I would say, don't live there, move somewhere else. Because, if you go to the Middle East, where does the water come from? Water comes from desalination. It was ridiculous. You have to use energy to make the water desalinate. Also, you use the water, and a lot of people waste the water. So why can't you move to area where there is natural water rather than, tree? And that's the only species you have is the desert species and, and insects and, that type of fauna. So we should not be living there. Dubai is a mistake, But you go to the Middle East, give a lecture, and talk about this. My God, I'll be chopped into pieces, I'll be so, sushi in the Middle East.
With the weather outside, I would say, why are we living here?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, Alvi.
Just in relation to the issues that you've been discussing, how would you define your boundaries from an ecological perspective when you work on a project? Is it the building? Is it the neighborhood? Is it the island that you're working with? Is it the world, right? Is it hierarchical in relation to the different elements that you're working with? Is it material has a certain boundary conditions versus the other systems that you're working with, the humans, the animals, and so on and so forth?
Yes. Good question. It actually starts, you have to design at a number of levels, from the macro to the meso to the micro, to the nano. Nano means, you know, the microbes and the organisms in the ground. You know, micro means the ecosystems and its biome, and then there's the bioregion as the meso, and then the macro will be the biosphere as a whole. And so you have to make choices. You cannot cover everything. One of the best conversations I had is with a famous Indian architect called Charles Correa, and then one day I was having a conversation with him. I said, Charles, there's so many things you have to consider in designing. And those of you who were around in the 60s will know that there was a huge movement in design methods, you know, particularly people like Chris Jones, who wrote the book on design methods, that, you know, there's so many things you need to consider in design. Which one do you take, which you consider first? And Charles said to me, you cannot cover everything. Impossible. But you have to use intuition to select the best and most correct way, because that's the best you can do as an architect. Then I said, but that's very variable. He says, that's why being an architect, you have to heighten your sense of intuition so that after a while, you know that your intuition is almost spot on. You know, when I did the National Library in Singapore, we won that in a competition, and we had a project manager who was a gentleman from Oklahoma. You know, it's a real Okie type accent whenever he wants, you know, it slips out. And I did 25 designs before the scheme was effected. Can you imagine doing 25 designs for a particular project? Until all my joint consultants says, you know, stop pissing around, Ken, just do whatever he wants, and then let's get on with life, you know? So I said, no, I just want to do what I think is important for the site. So finally, I went to the boss of the library, and I said, look, you know, Dr. Chia, I says, you know, this is what your project manager wants me to do, and this is what I want to do. But I brought a professor from the National University of Singapore, and the boss of National Library couldn't decide. He says, well, talk to, you know, Dr. Lam, who's now professor at Pittsburgh at Carnegie. And Dr. Lam says, go back to Ken design because it resembles his first design that he did intuitively, and not the 24 other designs he did afterwards, because that's the best design. Because the first design, you did it intuitively, you got it right the first time, but don't try and think too much about it and change it. And so in that sense, it's very difficult to answer your question, except that you have to intuitively heighten your sense of your gut feel intuition, that you try and post-rationalize it later on. It's a sort of great sort of, you know, design debate, whether design is a priori or post priori. Do you design first and justify later on, or you justify it first and then you design later on? And so most times I design it first, then I said, you know, have I done the right thing? If not, then I modify it, intuitively choose the right solution. That's the best we can do. Because, you know, if you start thinking too much about it, the project will go to another architect, you know? So, yes,
my question is.
Yes, ma'am.
Is over here.
Oh, there you are. Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes. Oh, it's you.
So it's about whether your building produces knowledge.
Buildings what?
Produce knowledge, ecological knowledge. Have you considered doing a bioblitz of these corridors and landscapes that you put on buildings? A bioblitz is a count of biodiversity,
yes,
and then measuring what's there against the target. And I think, have you convinced you and your ecologist of asking the client to fund this kind of research afterwards, because it would be fantastic form of producing knowledge about the strata
yes,
of.
Right. Well, you know, we treat our work as research, in that sense that we cannot do all the research at the same time. We do research at different levels, and then having completed a project, we put everything together and compile these into a book. So, you know, that explains my books. But one of the things we're trying to do now, as what you say, is to assess the biodiversity of the design. Now that again is controversial because, you know, sometimes most ecologists don't agree, and they get really annoyed with me because I said I would tell them one man's flower is another man's weed. And there are different methods of measuring biodiversity. The latest one's called ESII. It's an acronym we should Google because it's developed by somebody in the West Coast. But that system developed is only particular to the climate conditions in the West Coast of U.S. But they're trying to extend it to the East Coast and throughout the whole world, but they haven't got to that stage yet. But it's a pretty good system. So you check it out because for measuring the biodiversity consequences of a particular design. Okay. Well, otherwise, ecologists go all over the place. I mean, ecologists, with due respect to them, they're not particularly mentally organized people. Not like architects. Yes.
Back here.
Yes, sir.
I admire your work since I was a student here, like a long time ago, and I absolutely share your Arcadian dreams, so to speak.
Yes.
But I have a question about transformation and about the conceptual difference between the, kind of robust precision of a machine on the one hand and the resilience of an ecology on the other hand. So the question is a bit, how do you deal with transformation, with life cycles, with adaptation, with the kind of flexibility which we need and enjoy in truly natural systems? How do you apply this type of thinking to your built work?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't know. I have to think about it.
No, but like in retrospect, you having all of this experience, would you want to have more flexibility in your buildings? Would you... Do you think they work well as they are? Do you think they should be more flexible? Because I think the biggest danger of green buildings is their featureism. That we believe we have solved the problem by reaching certain KPIs, but in the end we just solidified a particular expectations into concrete and glass, and these expectations might be completely wrong.
Well, everything you say is true because I've done some. Not for all my buildings, and maybe about 10% of them, we've done post-occupancy evaluation, and well, there are a lot of times, a lot of things that we did don't work, and so we try and learn from what we've done, and that we try to correct it in our next building. For instance, back in the 80s, I did a building where I have planters, and we didn't allow for an irrigation system that removes the rainwater from the planter. And so sometimes the rainwater is so intense that it covers the whole of the planter, it overflows to the balcony, into the floor, destroys the carpet, which we had to compensate. So now we have to design, the roof gardens and the balconies with secondary irrigation, not just below the planting area, but on top of the planting, so that you get any water that overflows above the surface of the planted area is drained off. And so these are some of the things, these are some things we live and learn, and that it's an expensive lesson. But what I'm trying to say is that not everything we do works. And I have to admit it because, what we do is fairly experimental. And we have to be honest about it. It's not 100% effective. But it's an ongoing experiment, if you like. There are not enough people to do what we do because, to be frank with you, my generation is a dead loss because none of us have been brought up in ecology. The future's with you guys. You have still the opportunity to learn ecology, whereas most architects that I meet today, all the famous architects, all the Pritzker Prize winners, the level of arrogance is incredible. They deny ecology. They ignore it, and you talk to them, they just brush it aside. And so my generation is a bit too late, but not too late for you guys and for the next generation. But,
I think this will be the last.
Sorry, just let me answer this quickly, because in 10 years' time, all of you will design green buildings as authentically and even better than any of us can do it. Now, that's a good sign because, you see, architecture, the purpose of architecture is to make people happy. Green buildings is just one part of the process, one of the several things that we do. So when you're able to make buildings green, then you focus on what architecture should be doing, is to give pleasure and give happiness to people. And that's the power of architecture, and that's what we should be focusing on. beyond just green buildings, because I just happen to work in green buildings because, you know, nobody's doing it. And nobody's doing it to the level that I would like it to be done. And so the future is with you guys. The future is to make not just green buildings, because you should do buildings, green buildings as second nature, but to design buildings to make people happy, to give pleasure to their lives. Now, let's say we do an office building that gives pleasure to its users, or design a house that makes a family extremely happy and live a wonderful life. Your whole purpose of being an architect is fulfilled, because that's what we should be doing. And it doesn't cost an awful lot of money to do this. I can give some examples, so I do need to offer a lot of money, but we run out of time. So, you know, well, thank you very much. Time to go and have some nosh, and thank you for coming.